Residence? Okay. Alright, chat. BRB.
In many nations, the position of head of state and head of government are divided. The head of government is the chief officer of the executive branch, and the head of state is the public representative whose duties vary depending on the nation's constitution. In Austria, the president is the head of state and the federal chancellor is the head of government. In Denmark, the queen is the head of state and the prime minister is the head of government. In the United States of America, the president is both the head of state and the head of government. Internationally, this is not too unusual as many nation-states in Africa and South America combine head of state and head of government. But this is unusual, even unique, in the global north, the term associated with rich nations. Due to this consolidation of power within the structure of the United States, as well as the international influence and wealth of the United States, the president is arguably the most powerful and influential individual in the world. The President of the United States is the only nationally elected representative in the nation. Other representatives are elected only by their district, only by their city, and so forth, depending on the political office. The President, so they say, represents the entirety of the nation. Every 4 years, the people of the United States take all of their rights, their safety, their autonomy, and their power and willingly hand it over to this representative. This is the one act, they are told, that defines them as Americans and as good citizens. The people have been conditioned to imagine the general election as an exercise in democracy that faithfully elects their representative, instead of seeing it for how it functions in practice, choosing who will rule over them. The people frame this relationship of power as the people above the president, having final authority on who will be the president. But once said president is elected, the relationship grants authority to the president, not the people, making the election not an exercise in power, but the surrender of power. The right to choose the president is certainly a lot better than no right to choose the president, and we absolutely should exercise that right. But the mere existence of a head of state, chosen or otherwise, does not make us more powerful. Because of this emphasis on the election, this focus on one day of participation, the ritual of the general election hides opportunities for more direct action. Activism, protest, building solidarity through groups and unions, actual democratic power, self-governance, democracy taken seriously. Once we fill out our ballots, we neglect to exercise our agency for years, drifting through our days, safe in the knowledge that our ruler has our best interests at heart. A faith in paternalism more than government, worship more than autonomy. Defenders of this consolidation of power invariably reference the checks and balances that children in the United States are taught and then expected to assume are functioning properly as adults. However, the increasing authority of a single individual calls this common wisdom into question. The Constitution of the United States, once granting the president only the authority of a functionary officer, has been stretched to give the president far greater authority than the legislature in many instances, and absolute authority in other instances. Defenders of this consolidation of power often retreat to referencing kings and queens to draw contrast between the antiquated executive power of old and the modern, allegedly checked executive power of today. While the President of the United States is not a king, the President's reach and influence is greater now than, say, King George III. An 18th century king could not wage war through drone strikes and did not have access to a nuclear arsenal. The President of the United States in the 21st century has been granted, and in some cases has granted himself, unilateral authority that bypasses Congress. An 18th century king did not have a surveillance system to spy on every citizen of the entire nation, but a 21st century president nominates the heads of the National Security Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of Homeland Security, and the heads of a number of other federal executive departments that control and surveil the people. The only way in which an 18th century king was more powerful than a 21st century president was that their power was established through hereditary inheritance. However, some presidents and presidential candidates are relatives of former presidents or are born into the wealth required to launch such a campaign. The president, unlike a king, may have term limits, but the president establishes federal officers and nominates Court of Appeal judges, district court judges, and Supreme Court justices who are loyal to the president's political goals and ideology. In effect, they continue the president's rule through ideology long after the president has retired or even died. The modern president of the United States has significantly more power than King George III had, who, lest we forget, was cast aside to form the independent nation to begin with. The increasing overreach of the executive branch is not only a failure of checks and balances in one nation, it is the inevitable outcome of vertical power hierarchies and the increasing authority of the modern state. States granting more and more violent authority to themselves internationally runs parallel to the president granting more and more violent authority to himself. The President of the United States is simply the most obvious example of this unassailable pattern of the past few centuries. Defenders of the United States' limited democracy often say, "This isn't a democracy, it's a republic." Yes, that is the problem. Restating the problem as if it were the answer is not an argument. If we acknowledge that the fewer who hold power, the less democracy we have, and the more power that these few have, the less democracy we have, then we have to conclude that the existence of a modern president, meaning incredible power held by only one individual, makes us less free. How did this happen? How does it currently function? And what can we do about it? Modern glorification of the president sets Americans' imaginations on George Washington as the father of the nation, and if he were the first president, then surely that is when the nation truly began. But that is not true. Following the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the United States of America did not have a president for 13 years. The Articles of Confederation did not create an office of the presidency, an executive. Instead, the first organization of the government of the United States was represented by co-equal states with a horizontal distribution of power. Some historians claim that the Articles of Confederation failed because this early constitution created a weak government. But modern scholarship and research shows that the economy was actually doing very well in the 1780s. According to Dana D. Nelson, author of Bad for Democracy, the office of the presidency was created to better control the people. The growing democratic involvement was amplified in the increasing phenomenon of extra-governmental organizations of people, county assemblies, watchdog committees, radical associations, and other unofficial out-of-door actions. We typically remember these self-organizations of citizens in the framers' hostile terms as a threat to orderly government. This might sometimes have been true, but from another vantage, we can just see them as people excited about and experimenting with new practices of participatory self-government. It was this democratic excitement that the new office of the presidency was designed, in part, to calm. Radical free associations and rebellions against the wealthy class concerned the Founding Fathers as they themselves were among the wealthy class. At the Constitutional Convention, the signers aimed to put a stop to this and create a strong government to better control the poor. With this came the creation of the executive officer. So concerned were the Founding Fathers that Alexander Hamilton infamously suggested that the president be chosen for life and that the people are not to be trusted. In his own words, "All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, and the other the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God, and however generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right." Although the Constitutional Convention thankfully did not...
Again, whenever we're talking about the foundations of our constitutions and the intent that our forefathers had, all right, they had no intention of wielding of getting rid of their power and in fact wielding their power in a way where they would control the decisions made in the form of our governance, in the form of a representative democracy. They wanted to hold on to as much power as possible. They did not want to give power to the people. In fact, they saw a danger. They saw a disadvantage on giving the power to the people, almost as if they felt it was foregoing the power that they should hold as representatives in our democracy, and they saw a real threat to giving too much power to the people. And that's the reason why we don't have a representative democracy, or we don't have a direct democracy. We have a constitutional republic, because of the power that the forefathers wanted to hold, and the benefit or the value of holding on to this power and giving as little representation or little power to the people as possible. Legislature and law enforcement authority are in place to subjugate the poor. Of course, they had to forfeit some of their power onto the people. They had to forfeit some of their power onto the people, right? Because that was the premise from which this is the very premise of their reason for starting a new nation, free of tyranny, free of the monarchy and subjugation that they experienced in England and other parts of Europe. It was this notion that we should have a free and fair election. We should have a democracy of the people, for the people, by the people. But at the same time, we know, because it's pretty well documented at this point, that the true meaning of the American democracy was not to give power to the people to wield as they see fit. It was to hold on to as much power by way of a constitutional republic, and given the aesthetics of a representative democracy, more so than a functioning democracy. So free of monarchy and still full of elites oppressing the people. Precisely. We just heard how the forefathers had disdain for everyday poor people who were born poor. There was a great interest in trying to limit as much power as possible for these individuals. Can you look down and spell attic? I'm not doing that because I know what you're doing. I know what you're doing. Stairway to hell. Nice try.
Take Hamilton's advice.
Damn, that's like 90s. Those are 90s jokes.
About the nation being ruled by an executive chosen for life, his general beliefs about the control of the people, those he did not consider well-born, was accepted. Neither the Articles of Confederation nor the initial Constitution of the United States provided for popular elections, except for the House of Representatives, but only for property-holding white men. The Constitution provided for senators to be elected by state legislators, not the people. For the president to be elected by electors chosen by state legislators, not the people. And for the Supreme Court to be appointed by the president, not the people. Again, if we acknowledge that the fewer people are given power, the less democracy there is, and the more power that the few are given, the less democracy there is, then the creation of the presidency in the Constitution of the United States made the people less free. Bestowing incredible power into the very few is argued as a means of maintaining peace and defeating disorder, as was said in the Federalist Papers, but the aim of the state itself is not to maintain order as a kind of impartial judge. The state maintains a particular kind of order, a particular distribution of power, a particular distribution of wealth. The disorder that worries the state is rebellion against those who control the wealth. With this in mind, the creation of the president by the very class who controlled the wealth can be seen as fortifying itself against rebellion and maintaining control over the poor and over the people in general. There was a brief moment in history in which the United States could have continued without a president, even with the dissolution of the Articles of Confederation. During the Constitutional Convention, those present debated forming an executive office that would be shared, perhaps co-equally, among several people. A concept not unlike the Swiss model of government today. Those who supported this model of the executive branch perhaps feared what a single executive could do, having only recently cast off the King of England. Proponents of a single president argued instead that a sole executive would offer a sense of governmental strength, or, to put it in more realistic terms, a single executive would have the people attach their sense of self to a single man. That single man, that president, would represent the nation to the people. Attacking the president would be seen as tantamount to attacking the nation. The people would learn to trust the president in spite of what he might do. In other words, for reasons of propaganda and control, a sole executive who represented the nation suited the interests of the wealthy political class. We see this in action even today, as criticizing the president is met with cries of, "That's your president you're talking about," by his defenders. If the president is criticized by a foreign power, his defenders will feel that they too have been insulted, and will then support the president with even greater zeal. The president represents the strength of the nation. When Americans are unsatisfied,
We learned this, but it wasn't broken down in this regard. It wasn't viewed from this perspective to cast doubt on the institutions or the groundwork laid by the forefathers, to suggest that this was by design in an attempt to limit as much power to the people as possible, right? They write this in our history books. They write this in our political science books as an advantageous means to lay out a system of government that gives just enough power to the people that allows for order, right, in our society, and it's never questioned, it's never challenged, it's accepted as the best way it could have been designed possible. Important one, structure of government is not explained. Exactly.
with the president's performance, instead of believing the president should be given less power or finding ways to limit the president's power, the president is instead given more power, with the promise that greater authority will allow the president to accomplish his goals. This is touted as strong leadership instead of what it is: the consistent increase of presidential power throughout the course of American history. Presidential powers are not simply those that are written explicitly in the United States Constitution. They are also a series of implied powers that a president has suggested that he has, then has exercised successfully, subsequently creating a precedent either in law or in ritual to normalize and codify this power. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution establishes the authority of the president, but this authority has been stretched and expanded through these implied powers. For example, the power to pardon is explicitly given in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, but the manner in which this should be carried out, as well as limits on pardons, are vague. Pardons are only mentioned once in the Constitution, practically in passing. And he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Presidents have pushed the limits of pardons to suit their political goals and personal interests, and since the Supreme Court is often made up at least partly by justices who were chosen by that very president, this executive overreach is often held up as constitutional, and therefore permissible by future presidents as well. For example, in 1865, Congress passed a law that disbarred former members of the Confederacy. Augustus Hill Garland, a former Confederate senator, received a pardon from President Andrew Johnson. This ended up in the Supreme Court, and the court sided with President Johnson. Because of this reaffirmation of the absolute nature of the presidential pardon, the president can even pardon individuals who have not yet been charged or convicted. Preemptive pardons. That was the court precedent used in the presidential pardon of Richard Nixon. It also allowed President George H.W. Bush to pardon former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger and former CIA official Duane Claridge before they were tried on Iran-Contra affair charges. Presidential authority that is implied but not explicitly stated by the Constitution is often cited, but implied limitations are hypocritically ignored. For example, the end of the sentence, except in cases of impeachment, is implied to bar the president from pardoning anyone being impeached or anyone involved in charges related to the president's own impeachment. However, because it does not explicitly say so or go into details, the traditional view of this part of the clause is that only impeachment charges themselves are precluded from presidential pardons. The impeachment charges against President Donald Trump focuses predominantly on his allegedly withholding of foreign aid from Ukraine, but the articles of impeachment also reference his previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections, meaning Russian interference in the 2016 election. Roger Stone was convicted of obstructing an investigation into Russian election interference. This means that President Trump should not have been able to commute Stone's sentence, since his conviction was related to Trump's impeachment charges. The part of the clause about impeachment is clearly meant to suggest that the president cannot use the pardon to protect himself. Nevertheless, Stone's sentence was commuted. Wealthy individuals who commit crimes in favor of the president know that they can be pardoned, or have their sentence commuted if they are caught. For example, President Ronald Reagan pardoned New York Yankees owner George Steinbrenner, having previously been convicted of 14 counts of illegal contributions to Richard Nixon. President Donald Trump pardoned Dinesh D'Souza for his illegal campaign contributions. In short, implied powers are utilized and implied limitations are ignored. Although the president seemingly does not have the power to pardon himself, he is almost completely protected from prosecution.
He asked, though. Don't forget. He fucking asked, though. He asked the question, can I pardon myself? Y'all remember that, right? You all remember that. It happened. He 100% asked if he could pardon himself, which is by definition, which is by default, an admission of guilt. An admission of guilt. What an idiot. I can't believe we elected this person president, and I can't believe 70 million people voted for him again.
Anything he does in office of any legal consequences. To be clear, the United States Constitution does not say that the president cannot be charged, arrested, and prosecuted. So who says that the president cannot be prosecuted? Only the Department of Justice. And who selects Attorney General.
Well, the people who voted for him are not in this room. I am so sorry, but I'm just saying 70 million people voted for him. The aftermath is going to be weird. The aftermath is going to be weird because the legacy of Donald Trump will live on far after he is removed from office, perhaps forcibly. Nobody has ever told him no. 8 million more than in 2016. That is true. Fun fact, a lot of people are stupid. I'm stupid. I say dumb shit all the time. Like, I know that it's easy to, like, have a moment when we all look kind of dumb, but somebody who fell victim to Donald Trump's trickery, his snake oil salesman rhetoric, his right-wing messaging, and believed it not once, but twice. Look, I know a few people who fell for Donald Trump's games in 2016. They didn't make the same mistakes in 2020, but far too many people did. And in fact, he did receive more votes in this cycle than he did in 2016. So people definitely did see some value in a Trump presidency, right? Didn't Trump tell his voters to vote twice? So technically he only got 35. He'd vote early and vote often. And he only lost white men. Fox News has already lobotomized them. 99.9% of politicians are snake oil salesmen. I have a counterpoint. We're going to stop what we're doing. Let's say that the reason why politicians are snake oil salesmen, all right, because of the game itself, all right? Now, we know that we have an issue with campaign finance in this country, right? I was going to ask if y'all have seen House of Cards, and, whether or not that is completely, if that's an assessment to make, that might take away from my intellectual rebuttal here. But the issue here, the issue here is that I think a lot of politicians who are running campaigns on leftist populist messaging don't have the corporate backing in order to compete with candidates who receive a lot of financial support from private sectors that help fund their campaign, and also because of the established rules and decorum that exist in both parties. If you dare to try to run a good and honest campaign, if you try to divorce yourself from the establishment foundations, from the establishment members of the parties that hold more power or weight and have influence, like the Chuck Schumers and the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, then you do have an issue, right? From the jump. You will lose support from the DCCC if you are running as a Democrat. If you do not adhere to the rules or the standards from the party, then you might not have either the financial support that is absolutely required in order to run a campaign, a successful campaign in this day and age, and then you lose the institutional backing of your party, which means that you have gone rogue in a way, and it's up to you to be able to garner enough support from your own constituents, and that too can be incredibly difficult. That is no easy feat, which is why I say that I think leaders in a community who have that established rapport, at least some established rapport, do stand a greater chance of winning based on their campaign rhetoric and their promise to serve their people, right? In the event that they don't have the institutional backing or the financial assistance from any mega donor, right, that would help fund their campaign to get them on the airwaves, to have the ability to compete with their political opponent. And it's really hard to win if you are not a snake oil salesman politician, is what I mean. If it weren't so difficult, I think that we would have more good, honest, genuine politicians, at least on the Democratic side, right? But they don't win. They don't win. Backstabbing in politics is common too. Yes. Special and corporate interests play such a huge foundational role in our politics. Foundational. Hi, my name is Amy C3, and special interests and corporate interests play such a huge role in our political arena that if you are a political candidate or if you are a sitting member opponent, if you're a sitting member of any office, then in order for you to maintain your power, right? Because once you sit in that seat, you might feel like it feels good. Feels good to sit in that seat, right? But then how do you secure your next win, your next re-election? And that's whenever you start getting, you start getting talks with lobbyists who will ensure that they fund your campaign or that they do political favors. They help you keep your seat in exchange for legislation that benefits their own special interests. Is that a West Virginia accent? Yes. I have a West Virginia accent. I was born with a little twang, I do believe. Sometimes it rears its ugly head, so I just roll with it. We had a national stockpile of PPE that we already paid for, but Donald had Kushner auction the PPE back to the States. If he sells you snake oil, you still have to wonder if he will deliver it. Oh, that's kind of cute. You should say hi to... Who? Amy Country 3. What part of West Virginia are you from? The Northern Panhandle region, the Ohio Valley? Gay Man 1969, thank you for the follow. Oh, you're gone. Also, have you buried your skeletons from the closet, or have you buried your skeletons from the closet, or will the opponents or challengers use it against you? Also, that's the political backstabbing that we're talking about. You have to have a squeaky clean record, all right? Any weakness or vulnerability that could ultimately tank your chances of election is also the reason why I think it's incredibly difficult to find people, to incentivize people to run for office right now. But again, this is the reason why, if you are a human being, which most of us are, and you have skeletons in your closet, you might have to ensure that you have a nice pool of money to be able to pay off and fight back against anybody who could essentially tank your own campaign. Speak for yourself? Okay. And so it does help whenever you have corporate backing or special interest or lobby money to your advantage to ensure that you can pay off all of your misdeeds that could come back to haunt you on the campaign trail. If you are a human being, I'm a robot. Does dirt on opponents even matter anymore? Look at the Epstein circle. To manipulate it and spin it to discredit your competition. Oh, so you're saying I can never run for office? I mean, you can run for office if you're ready to accept that people are going to try to use your mistakes from your past against you. Right? Or lack of the past. What if your past is classified somewhat? Well, then I guess you would stand a better chance.
General, the head of the department, the president. Thus, even though it is technically not law or in the Constitution, the policy to protect the president is enforced by a federal executive department whose head is chosen by the president. This immunity from prosecution is another example of the president becoming more powerful over time. As the Department of Justice...
Dirt won't smear your opponent if your opponent is made of dirt. You raise such a great point. Donald Trump, what did Donald Trump have to his advantage in order to help secure his chances of election in 2016? He had money. He had money that he used to pay off his mistresses, to pay off all of the people to keep quiet so that they didn't throw dirt on his campaign. Precisely that. If you don't have a squeaky clean record and you are trying to run as a good progressive candidate who is trying to be of service of the people, but you have done some shady shit in your past that could be used against you, then guess what? You don't have as good of chances to run and win, especially without having that excess funds available to be able to, and again, that would be wrong, right? People, if you are running a good and honest and forthright and forthcoming progressive campaign, then you shouldn't have to pay anybody off. That kind of defeats the purpose. But at the same time, you do run the risk of somebody coming forward with stories of your past that could ultimately tank your entire candidacy. LOL, politics made Trump broke. Pretty sure Trump might have been broke before that. But who really knows? He won't release the tax returns. Can you just run as a Republican and no one will care how much dirt you have on you? Trump was living in debt. Word on the street.
That protects the president did not even exist until 1870, almost a century after the United States declared its independence. The very structure of the government changed to give even greater power to the president. The only remedy for a criminal president is the impeachment process outlined in the Constitution.
Word on the Wall Street. Yeah, I haven't released my tax returns because I'm not running for office anytime soon.
Article 2, Section 4. The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. However, the makeup of the nation and how it interacts with the government changed following the signing and ratification of the Constitution that outlined this process. The Constitution was signed in 1787 and was put into effect by 1788. Only after its ratification did the United States have its first formal political party, the Federalist Party, in 1789. This spun out of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debates in drafting the Constitution. The House of Representatives has impeached Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, but the Senate has never convicted. This is because the Constitution states that the House only requires a simple majority, but the Senate requires a 2/3 vote to convict, meaning the vote to convict must be bipartisan. If there were, say, 3 major parties in the United States, a Senate conviction might be possible, but in a 2-party system, the barrier is too high. In other words, due to the emergence of the party system, the president is nearly invulnerable to conviction by the Senate. And even if he were convicted, the Constitution states that the penalty for conviction is simply removal from office. The Senate is not putting the president on trial in the traditional sense. If the president ever feels that he could be convicted by the Senate and charged after he is no longer a sitting president, he can always resign before impeachment even comes up in the House and have his vice president pardon him in exchange for the presidency. The people of the United States of America are at the absolute mercy of the president if there is nothing he can't do and nothing he can't get away with. If the president is effectively above the law, then the president has too much power.
Well, there you go.
According to Bad for Democracy by Dana Nelson, the Constitution, as we know, both defines and limits the powers of the 3 branches. Its description of presidential powers, however, is both less extended and less precise than its description of the scope and limits of the legislative and judicial branches. A vagueness within which claims to executive power have found traction. It also seems possible that understandings of the founders' intent have changed with the times. To take a prominent example of such a historical shift, the Constitution denominates the President as Commander-in-Chief. This is a title that seemingly decrees wide powers over democracy for the President, but most governmental historians agree that the title, invented by King Charles of England in 1639 and regularly granted to the British colonies' governors, was a simple and hollow formality, not a signal that the President was to be vested with supreme constitutional agency. Even the authors of the aforementioned Federalist Papers, who were strongly in favor of having a president, were explicit that there was no intention in the Constitution whatsoever to give significant war powers to a single individual, even the president. Nevertheless, when a president wanted more power in foreign policy, he exercised it through this vague, formal title of Commander-in-Chief. For example, President John Tyler expanded the powers of the presidency in regards to the military through the annexation of Texas. Tyler used Secret Service funds to support military actions without congressional approval. This effectively seized war powers in peacetime. When Abraham Lincoln assumed his office, Congress was in recess, So he delayed their convening so that he could act unilaterally, enlarge both the Army and Navy beyond their authorized strength, spend public money without congressional approval, and institute a naval blockade. Theodore Roosevelt expanded war powers further by interjecting into the Russo-Japanese War and committing the U.S. military to support Japan. When he was told that doing so without Congress was unconstitutional, he simply disagreed, and that was that. Roosevelt claimed that the powers implied in the Constitution, "He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed," was both vague and broad enough for him to do as he pleased. All these instances had the president decide that he had more power than previously used, institute that power, and wait to see if he could get away with it. Once he did get away with it, the executive overreach was no longer overreach. It became the norm. Moving to more contemporary wars, when Richard Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia, it normalized the commander-in-chief's authority to invade and bomb even neutral countries during a time of war or peace. In 1969 and 1970, Congress voted to deny funding for U.S. ground troops in Cambodia, as well as Laos and Thailand. Nixon signed the bills into law, but also stated that doing so meant nothing, remarking that his signature will not change the policies I have pursued and that I shall continue to pursue toward this end. Congress passed the War Powers Act to stop Nixon, which he vetoed, which Congress was finally able to override. Nevertheless, the damage had been done, and the War Powers Act contained enough loopholes to be effectively worthless for future presidents. No president has accepted the constitutionality of the War Powers Act, claiming it violates the separation of powers and president's authority as commander-in-chief. However, others would argue that unilateral war powers are the actual violation of separation of powers, and that the War Powers Act merely reinforces language already in the Constitution. In 2001, after some international back and forth over the legality of threatening war over a matter of extradition, the administration asked Congress to pass the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Terrorists, a resolution that allowed the U.S. military to attack Afghanistan. However, in Congress's haste, it gave George W. Bush and future presidents a blank check to wage war, order drone strikes, and commit to bombings of any nation suspected to have terrorists, which covers, broadly, any nation. Section 2 of the AUMF explicitly states that this does not replace the War Powers Act, but the AUMF has made the War Powers Act even more toothless than it once was. When a president wants to avoid the deadlines for congressional authorization outlined in the War Powers Act, the president simply says that the military intervention in question is not a war, but some other action distinct from a war, a defense sometimes used by the Barack Obama administration. Author M. Schlesinger, author of The Imperial Presidency, wrote, "The Founding Fathers made a deliberate effort to divide the control of the war powers. They vested in Congress the authority to commence and authorize war, whether that war be declared or undeclared. At the same time, they vested in the presidency the conduct both of ongoing foreign relations and ongoing war, as well as the right to respond to sudden attack when Congress was not in session. This division of powers was inherently unstable. The presidential power to conduct diplomacy and the congressional power to authorize hostilities had each the potentiality of overwhelming and nullifying the other. If the president were to claim all the implications of his control of diplomacy, he could, by creating an antecedent state of things, swallow up the congressional power to authorize hostilities. And that is exactly what has happened. In terms of war, the president does almost anything he wants. He drone strikes whoever he wants. He bombs whoever and wherever he wants. And if Congress disagrees and finds this unconstitutional or otherwise unlawful, the aforementioned limitations of impeachment provide little recourse." One power granted to the president is the ability to choose the heads of his federal executive departments, filling them with those of similar ideology or his political cronies. This is another example of presidential powers increasing over time because even though these appointments are within his rights, the amount of federal executive departments and the scope of these departments have both increased in the past 2 centuries. Congress set the date that the Constitution went into effect as March 4th, 1789, and later that year, the State Department, Treasury Department, and the Department of War were officially established, but everything else came about later. Department of Interior in 1849, Agriculture in 1862, Justice in 1870, Labor in 1913, Commerce in 1937, Department of War changed to Department of Defense in 1947, Health and Human Services in 1953, House and Urban Development in 1965, Transportation in 1967, Energy in 1977, Education in 1979, Veterans Affairs in 1989, and Homeland Security in 2002. Furthermore, the President appoints the heads of other organizations that did not exist during the time of the Founding Fathers, such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, established in 1908, the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947, the National Security Agency in 1953, and so forth. In short, though the President always had the authority to make such appointments, the amount of appointments did not exist until later on. These new departments and the President's influence on said departments has given the President increasing power and control over the centuries. These departments can, and have been, weaponized to serve the President and his political goals. Presidents direct these departments through executive orders, an authority that only exists in the Constitution because presidents have consistently said it does, and because their Supreme Courts have largely accepted this. The Constitution does not contain the words executive orders. Instead, presidents cite the take care that the laws should be executed.
Wow, that's big government. Isn't it interesting that we've seen a pattern here where the federal government, the executive branch of government, in fact, takes it upon themselves to monopolize a lot of our agencies in this country, right? From education, which is good, housing and urban development, I can point to that exactly to show how that is problematic, where you maintain control over, the general operations of our own built environments, but the problem is that you never fully fund those operations to its full capacity to address all of the grievances or needs at the community level. This is problematic, where you control so much power and you maintain power by way of mandating oversight through the development, through the operationalization of our own cities, our housing authorities, and everything else that goes into our housing department and our built environment even. And that is all well and good if you are planning to ensure centralized power that does go all the way from the top down to the very bottom, at the very lowest level, the community level, the block level, the neighborhood level. And that doesn't happen with HUD, right? All of that power is stored at the very top, where you have to go through the grueling bureaucratic administrative process to get funding for housing development, for low-income housing, for Section 8. But again, there's never political will to fully fund any of our housing assistance programs, any of our rental assistance programs, in redeveloping or revitalizing our disinvested or blighted areas, right? So it's this austerity, this negligence that we see from our very own institution that have dominated our housing agencies, our housing market in many ways, from the perspective of offering assistance, right? That's the reason why the federal government has really leaned into the neoliberal project in this country, where they do not accept full responsibility for giving decent housing to everyone. They outsource as much of that as possible to the private sector to ensure that there are plenty of options. There's bountiful housing stock out there, but is it affordable? No. Does the government intervene to make housing more affordable? No. Precisely what I mean. Sorry for the jumbled explanation in the beginning.
Which is an extremely broad view. Some scholars believe that take care certainly does not mean create, but only enforce federal law. Executive orders were uncommon during the early days of the presidency, as the first 5 presidents signed a total of 15 executive orders combined. Theodore Roosevelt changed all of this, signing over 1,000 executive orders. Since Roosevelt, all subsequent presidents signed over 100, or in some cases over 1,000, executive orders. The lowest was Gerald Ford, who served less than one term, at 169 orders, and the highest was FDR at 3,728. The president does more than just choose the heads of the departments. He can, and does, control the departments as much as he wants.
True.
According to Tara Brunham, author of President or King, the increased use of executive orders and other presidential directives is a fundamental problem in modern-day America. The Constitution does not give one individual an executive pen, enabling that individual to single-handedly write his preferred policy into law. Despite this lack of constitutional authority, presidential directives have been increasingly used, both by Republicans and Democrats, to promulgate laws and to support public policy initiatives in a manner that circumvents the proper lawmaking body, the United States Congress. It would be foolhardy to ignore the danger inherent in this situation simply because one might like the individual currently holding the presidential pen. It would be hypocritical as well as dangerous to seek change when a president from the opposing political party is in power, but to ignore the problem once a president from one's own party has been elected. When Congress wishes to limit the president's influence, they often find it difficult due to the president's veto power and the loyalty of his party. A loyal political party sides with their president far more often than not, making overriding a veto challenging. Every bill passed by the House and Senate, before it becomes law, must be presented to the president. He either signs it or vetoes it, returning it to Congress. This veto can only be overridden by a 2/3 majority in both the House and Senate. Constitutional scholars and apologists for presidential power claim that this is merely a check on the power of Congress, but the veto gives the president, a single individual, more power than as many as 66 out of the 100 senators. Only at 67 can the Senate have more say-so than one person, the president. And that does not happen all that much. It wasn't until John Tyler, the 10th president, before a veto was even overridden. And it wasn't until Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, before the president's success rate with the veto fell below 50%. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd president, issued 635 vetoes and was only overridden 9 times, meaning FDR's success rate with the veto was 97.6%. George H.W. Bush's success rate with his vetoes was a similar 96.6%. Clinton at 94.4%, Obama at 91.7%, and Trump, thus far, at 100%.
Jesus Christ.
The only modern president with a more mixed success rate with the veto was George W. Bush, and even he successfully rejected bills most of the time. Generally speaking, if the president does not want a bill to be signed into law, chances are the bill will not be signed into law.
100%.
In 1976, the president was granted even more power under the National Emergencies Act, which formalized the rules surrounding the president's ability to call for a national emergency. Under the act, the president grants himself over 100 statutory powers, everything from public health to defense. Obviously, this can be abused by any president, as whether or not something is an emergency is his judgment call alone. Ending a national emergency requires an act of Congress, but that can be vetoed by the president. During the Trump administration, the president declared a national emergency to secure funding for a border wall with Mexico.
Ken Starr on Fox News with Mark Levin has stated that counting all votes can be illegal.
When the national emergency was called to end by Congress, Trump simply vetoed the bill multiple times. To put it another way, the president can decide to grant himself significantly more power than he already has, and he is often the one who decides whether or not to keep that power. The pattern of presidential power over the centuries is that the president interprets the Constitution in the broadest possible sense, overreaches his power, and then once his executive overreach is either unchallenged or maintained following a failed challenge by Congress, future presidents continue with this new level of power and perform even more executive overreach. Increasing use of executive orders and vetoes, new federal departments, war powers, all of it came about by a president stretching the limits of power and seeing how much he could get away with. We know it doesn't have to be this way, because it wasn't always this way. Reformists would say that legislative reform, or even a constitutional amendment outlining the limits of the presidency with greater detail, are necessary. Some reformists even go further, citing European examples of the division of power, particularly the Swiss model of government. Switzerland's executive branch is actually a federal council of 7 people, a kind of collective presidency. The actual president has little, if any, real power over the rest of the council. This ceremonial president only serves a short 1-year term. Switzerland is organized through cantons and communes, and the people engage in semi-direct democracy. And some would say that we should go even further and move toward a society without any unjust social or economic hierarchies, which includes not only the removal of the head of state, but the removal of the state. I know which one I want. Regardless of whether one wants reform or revolution, it seems so clear, even among moderates, that the President of the United States has far too much unilateral authority for one person. So much power vested in only one person can be, and has been, disastrous. Haven't we progressed enough as a society that we shouldn't need to attach our sense of worth, sense of self, and national identity to a single individual? Our lives are our own. We can live in a world with no more presidents. Hi everyone. If you want to learn more, the primary research sources for this video essay were Bad for Democracy by Dana D. Nelson, The Imperial Presidency by Arthur M. Schlesinger.
Damn, chat, what do you think? Do you think we can survive without a president? No more presidents. Current video. Honestly, no. You don't think so? No, Amy as president is the best overall situation. I don't know about that. Seems like a lot of. Then how will I run for president? I guess I can't. Funny. Give me anarchy or give me death. Trump is proof that a president isn't needed. Well, that's the whole thing. Trump was in many ways just a mouthpiece for his very dangerous group of advisors who were calling all of the shots behind the scenes. Trump is very incompetent when it comes to making wise decisions, right? And he relied very heavily on his inner circles in crafting any executive order, any policy throughout his tenure as president, right? So I think Trump is an anomaly insofar as having ineptitude, having so much ineptitude that you don't even know how to really exercise your own executive power single-handedly, right? George W. Bush too, right? He's a symptom of the problem.